Ever since the Pillow Man became a Trumpist, I have developed a pillow phobia. So the first thing I had to do was have it removed. And now we can begin. Delighted to be here, and especially delighted. Andre and I spent, we are friends for a long time, but rarely get a chance to have serious conversations about his work. So I'm delighted to be able to be here with all of you to have that conversation. The place to begin, I think, is probably with the title of this book. It is not a common term. I had never come across it until I read Andre's book. So, Andre, what is Homo Irrealis?
Well, let me start by saying what Irrealis is. It's a grammatical term that is used by linguists. So I met some rather famous linguists and asked them, could you give me a definition of what Irrealis means? And the answer I got from the most prestigious one was, I have no idea. I never saw the word before. So I had to start all over again. But it does exist. And ironically, the dictionaries don't give you a good definition, if any. It's Wikipedia that will supply you with a good definition. And it's a working definition. And it's the one that I have to use because there's nothing else. But Irrealis means, it refers to what is known as a verbal mood. It's not the indicative mood, but it is like the subjunctive mood, the conditional mood, the optative mood, and I can go on naming all the moods that they exist. They don't exist in English, most of them. Conditional does. Imperative mood. They're all moods that reflect something that is not in existence. In other words, homo, which you probably know means man, like ecce homo, or for example, homo ludens, homo whatever, it always refers to a man that is such a thing. And so I decided to call my book Homo Irrealis because it is about a man, me principally, but many others, as you will see, who are not really rooted in the present tense. They are more rooted in the might have been, should have been, could have been, might still be, though really I'm afraid if it comes along, but I like wishing for it because I like the wish, but I don't like the actuality of it. Suddenly you say, wait a minute, you're talking about fantasy life. Yes, it is about your fantasy life, but if I asked you how many of you live in your fantasies or how many fantasies you have on a daily basis, you would be embarrassed to say all the time. Okay, so I'm not going to ask you, clearly. But it is a way of saying that there is another dimension to life that is not lived and that is difficult to live, and yet we sort of visit it all the time. And that's what Irrealis means.
But you live it?
In a way, I have two lives. One life is the life that I live with my colleagues, you, for example, with my friends, with my wife, with my children. That's one life. But then there's also my life that I spend in front of the screen of my computer. That's where I invent my life, or I reinvent it because I'm not quite satisfied with what life has given me. So I go to a different dimension. And I actually spend more time with my computer and my papers and so on than I do with real people.
But you also talk about nostalgia, and your nostalgia for Alexandria.
Yeah.
Where you were born and lived for 12 years?
15.
15
14,
years.
14, sorry, I get the numbers wrong, okay?
Okay.
No, I was...
Describe the nostalgia as you described it.
I will read a small paragraph from there. Basically, I was born in Egypt. I'm not Egyptian. I became Italian, and I was kicked out from Egypt because I was Jewish, because my father had a factory, and they just appropriated the factory, and they looted everything we owned. And then they kick you out, which is, if you look at it, it happens all over the world all the time. But I felt that I did not like being in Egypt when I was in Egypt. So I was already somewhat already anticipating leaving Egypt when I was in Egypt. I was anticipating being in Paris because that was my dream. I want to live the rest of my life in Paris. And I'm sure a lot of you have this fantasy, though you would not live in Paris for more than a month because you'd go crazy, okay? Because the French have ways of doing that to you. But what I'm trying to say is that I had this fantasy of wanting to be in France. So when I try to remember what life was like in Egypt, which I do regularly because I haven't forgotten it, to say this is the street I lived in, these are the people I knew, these are the things I did in Egypt is wrong. Most of my time was spent fantasizing in Egypt about life outside of Egypt. And so I was already in the future. And so when I'm looking at the past, I'm looking at a past that was really rooted already in the future. So it's a kind of bi-dimensional way of looking at life. And most of us, and I like to generalize because I think that most of us do know exactly what I'm talking about, is when you look back at your school days, say in grade school or in high school, you're already sort of looking forward to your college days while you were still in high school. And to look back at high school without thinking of yourself forecasting what college is like is to remember wrongly, if I can say that.
But what does that mean for someone who writes memoirs? I mean, you're writing, I don't even know how to describe it. You're writing about a past as you envision it from the present or from a future?
No, I'm writing about the past, but the past is meaningless to me if I'm not already looking at myself in the past, anticipating the person I was going to be later on in life. So I was already in two different places, but I think everybody is in two different places, at least two. You might be in more than two. And I like that because that's how I see my whole life has been. I was in the southern Mediterranean. I ended up on the north of Mediterranean. Then I went across the Atlantic and went to America. But in effect, these nomadic moves mean that every single time I was remembering and I was anticipating. Now, when you've been displaced 3 times, you begin to think, wait a second. The first time I was anticipating being in the second place, and in the second place I was already in the third, but I still have memories of all 3. So when you're writing a memoir, what you want to do is you want to summon up not what was, but what was lost. And one of the compliments that is always paid to me by people who have been in Egypt and have read my book, and I think they all have read my book, is that all I have to do is alter some of the names of the characters in my book and put the names of the characters in their book, and I have their lives. And they have my life. And what they're not saying to me, because they haven't anticipated this, they haven't thought it through, is that, in effect, the life that they had was not a life fully lived. They were already displaced before being displaced. And I captured that displacement.
Is this notion of living in exile, of being displaced, of being an eternal refugee,
Right.
Is this a 21st century human predicament, or are you an exception?
No, I think it is the condition of human beings. How many of you have gone back to your grade school, your kindergarten room as adults? You've done that. You know exactly. You walk into that classroom, it hasn't even changed. The same graphic stuff that was on the scribbled and carved into the desk is still there. And you're talking about going back 20 years later. Now, what are you doing in that classroom? What are you trying to do? You're trying to recapture your past? Yeah, that sounds good. You're trying to be the person you were, anticipating the person you've become. It's a bifocal way of looking at things. And so, in effect, it is the condition of humanity that I'm saying. Some people like to tell you, and how many of you know people like this who say, I live in the present? Okay, yeah, sure. So tell me another one, okay? Nobody lives in the present. They like to claim that they are. I am in the here and now, and I don't look back, and I don't want to anticipate. Baloney. Okay, so that's at least it's my take on their lives.
For a historian, for a historian, there's something confirming, affirmative, and refreshing about this, because as a historian, or as historians, we begin in the here and now.
Right.
But we quickly discover that the here and now is there and past, or somewhere else in future. You say, and I don't know where you say it, whether you say it in this book or some other book, that, no, it's Sebald. You talk about Sebald.
Right.
And in Sebald's writing, although Sebald is not a Jew, and I don't know if he has any characters that lived through the Holocaust.
Yes, he has the characters. They survived the Holocaust.
They survived the Holocaust, but even those who do not
Right.
survive the Holocaust, it is part of their lives.
Yes.
It is part of their consciousness, it is part of their being, and there's no escape from it.
Right.
And I think, again, as a historian, not a memoirist, and God forbid, I've saved the world from trying to write fiction.
Memoir, that is, okay.
Memoir or
They're the
fiction.
same thing.
They're the
That's
same thing.
basically-
Okay, we'll get into that in a minute. This notion, I'm writing about, I'm going to be talking later this afternoon about refugees and about displaced persons in Europe after World War II. And these are people who, for the rest of their lives, will carry around with them 3 lives that are all present at the same time. It's their pre-war lives, whether they were Jews or Catholic Poles or Latvian Lutherans. Then they carry around with them that life in between, when they were displaced persons in Germany, not wanting to go home, but with no place else to go, and marooned, exiled in Germany. And then they live a third life somewhere else. Those are 3 lives that they live, and they also live their parents' and grandparents' lives and their children's lives.
They pass on something to their children, yes.
But their children also affect who they are in the
Yes,
present.
right.
It's difficult to it's difficult to comprehend or to map out, but it complicates notions of identity which have become too rigid,
Right.
too fixed. I mean, we are multiple things. We are multiple people. We live in multiple worlds at the same time. And that's what's so, I think, brilliant, illuminating, and important about this book. If literature does anything for us, it makes us look at our world and ourselves in a different way, to see the Irrealis, to see something that's there, or should be there, or has been there, but that we didn't know about.
And we have no words for it.
And we have no words for it. And this is one of those books. Essays too often get short shrift. It's not a very literary term, but it's the only one I can come up with. And yet the essay is, as the essays in here are, it's Homo Irrealis essays. The essay is a very important form of literature when done right. And your essays are idiosyncratic in a way that every essay here is memoir.
It doesn't claim to be memoir, but it's really me looking at various writers, composers, film directors, painters, and so on.
Yeah.
Psychiatrists, too.
And opening up in entirely new dimensions. Okay, let me go back to something you said earlier and I didn't pick up on. Talk about the fact that memoir is fiction and fiction is memoir.
There are many people who apologize when they write a memoir and sort of alter a certain fact. And it's a memoir. It's not an autobiography. An autobiography, you're writing about things as they were. In a memoir, as I like to use the metaphor, you shift the furniture. You eliminate some pieces. You bring in some new pieces of furniture because what you care for is the chronicle of your life, not your actual life. It's the story, the narrative of your life that matters. And that's a hard thing to do if you want to do it really well. In other words, by really well, I mean you're capturing your identity, fugitive as it is, in a form that allows you to do that. An autobiography will not allow you to do that because you're sticking to historical, factual things. Whereas a memoir allows you to drift. How were you feeling on the day that such and such, when, for example, when I heard of the assassination of President Kennedy in 1963, I know how old I was then, I know what my reaction was, but it was all feeling, and feelings are, when you put them into words, they're already fugitive. You already altered the feeling when you're writing about it. If you put a comma to a feeling, you've altered the feeling. So, and I like this idea that writing hijacks reality because writing is out to do something else. It's distorting your life if you want. It changes your life because you want to capture your life as it really was, not as a narrative might allow you to do.
But as it really was is the memoir, not autobiography.
No, yes, as it really was is the memoir, because the memoir allows you to go into feelings, into sentiments that are in themselves already shifting on you as you're writing your sentence down.
You know, when Out of Egypt was 1994. If you were to write it today,
Oh, God.
would it be a very different book?
No, it would not be a different book, but I would have to be very careful. I would have to be very careful because people are very sensitive now. My mother was deaf. I've always said that my mother was deaf. Now I would have to use another word that is more politically correct. I'd have to say other things about people I truly hated. Okay, you're not supposed to hate people. No, I do hate some people. I may change my mind sometimes in a day. I might decide, oh, they're actually quite likable, but at a certain moment I hated them. And so you can't say that you hated something. You can't be too negative over things. For example, I've never forgiven the Egyptian government for what it did to me. It stole my money. I want my money back. I can't forget that. I can pretend I've forgotten because if I were to write my memoir of living in Egypt again, I would try to sort of soften certain things so that they won't offend many people. But I'm always very frank. But today I don't know if I would be able to do that. And there are many other things I've written.
What school did you go to in Alexandria?
I went to something called Victoria College.
Yeah, I met someone
Yeah.
who's angry on a plane about a year ago. I never told you this. And he said he was born in Alexandria. And I said, oh, do you know my friend André? He said, yeah. He said, but, you know, I'll never forgive him because of the way he represented the school.
Because how old was this person?
Just to be...
Slightly older than me?
Yeah.
You see, that's the difference, because when I went there, it was already changed from Victoria College, which was the name of the Queen, to Victory College.
Oh, see.
Okay, Victory College represents the Egyptian victory over England, France, and Israel, as if it had defeated all three. Hard to imagine that people believe that stuff, but when I wrote about Victoria College, it had already changed. It had become an entirely Arabized school. It was trying to purify itself of its English heritage, which was going back 100 years almost, and therefore I was nasty about it. He probably was slightly older than I was, and therefore still has good memory of the school.
Yeah, yeah. Did I hadn't intended to talk about Alexandria, but to what extent, I mean, 15 years, you were, you know, your mind was grown, consciousness expanded, you had developed an identity at 15.
Did I? I've never developed an identity. I don't know what my identity is.
Okay, I take that. In one of Andre's essays in Alibis,
Okay.
he begins. I was going to bring it with me, but it was too heavy to take two
Suitcase,
books.
come on, I know.
Yeah,
it's-
and in it he says, You go through this whole litany. I'm a Jew,
Oh,
but I
yes.
don't never go to synagogue. My parents are Turkish?
My father is Turkish.
Your father is Turkish.
And yes,
You were born in Alexandria.
I'm not Egyptian.
You're not Egyptian. You're
I
not
thought
Italian.
I
You're
thought
not
I was
French. Right.
But I'm not French. I can't stand the French.
And you've spent 3
No,
years.
I don't hate them.
Right.
Come on.
You spent 3 years in Europe, but you
Yes.
consider yourself European?
But I've never hardly ever lived in Europe. How could I be a European? But my whole culture was European. But everything about me is unstable and undefined, and that's why I don't like identity. The question of an identity means
Yeah.
that you're formalized into something.
Yeah.
I'll change my mind in 15 minutes. As soon as this talk is over, I'll go back and say, why did I say this? And,
But you're not going to erase the fact
yeah.
that you spent 15 years in Alexandria, that you're a Jew, though a non-practicing Jew, that your family was from Turkey to Italy or Italy to Turkey?
From Spain to Italy, from Italy to Turkey, and from Turkey to Egypt.
Yeah. So that's part of you.
Yes.
It's all this mixture that doesn't quite make sense.
It doesn't make sense, and so don't even try to give me an identity.
Right.
I don't have one. I
Yeah.
am perfectly happy to say.
But that's an identity.
It becomes, yes, it's kind of negative identity, but then everything about me is negative.
No,
so-
but it's not a negative identity. You can look at it in two ways, that you have no identity.
Right.
But that's not a negative. The fact is that all of these different
Yeah.
cultures, languages, customs, geographies go into the making of.
Yeah.
What about your kids?
My kids are
Are they Americans?
They're Americans. They're born in America.
Right.
They're Americans. They speak English among themselves, except when they don't want other people to understand them, so they speak in French. So I insisted that they speak French, among other reasons, because that's my mother tongue.
Yeah.
But I don't even know French well enough to write anything in French. I mean, I can write in French, but it's not going to sound right.
What was the first language you wrote in?
English.
But when you didn't write in English when you were in
Yes.
Alexandria.
I was, yes, because I went to British schools.
But you spoke French at home?
At home. Home was French, and Italian also.
Did your parents speak English and write in English?
My father knew English, yeah. And my mother only knew French because she knew Greek, and she knew some Arabic as well. But she was deaf, so for her to pick up a language wasn't an easy thing.
Let's talk about the transition from you write out of Egypt in 94, and then you do another book of essays, right?
Yes.
Okay. And your first novel is 2007?
Yes, right.
It's a long way.
Yeah.
I asked you this question once before, and you didn't give me a very good answer, so I'll ask it again.
Please ask again. What can I say?
When you were in Alexandria or in Italy or somewhere else, did you write stories? Did you imagine stories? Are there novels and short stories in some desk drawer somewhere, or that once existed and were burned?
They've not been burned. They probably were trashed, and a good thing. No, I wrote poetry, mostly. It was always poetry, and I thought I was going to become a poet.
What happened?
What happened is that I was not a good poet. But I'm in good company because I write prose as if I had tried to write poetry but failed, and therefore I'm sort of going down a few ladders to the realm of prose, which is exactly what two of my favorite writers have done, Proust and Joyce. Both of them are what I call lapsed or even failed poets.
Yeah.
They write English in such a way, and French, of course, in such a way that you sense that these people have a wonderful ear. They're writing with their ear. They're not just writing with their intelligence. And I love that because they're really trying to adopt some of the customs and the conventions of poetry into their prose.
Right.
So,
But Proust is, I mean, it just strikes me for the first time that one is an Irishman first and last. I mean, does not have this series of travels and identities that you have. And the same with Proust.
right. They're very, well, Proust, no, Joyce had trouble because he was Irish, but he didn't really like Ireland.
Yeah.
He wasn't crazy, but he escaped it, and he liked missing Ireland, but he didn't.
That's right. No, you're right.
He
Right,
never
yeah.
went back to Ireland. I mean, he
Right.
went back when his father died, I think.
But he never stopped writing about Ireland.
That's all he wrote about.
That's all he wrote about. In
Yeah. In Paris,
Paris.
Trieste, and in Zurich. And basically what he wanted to do is he would write to his friends all the time, tell me, what's the store that was next to that drugstore? How many steps are there in that particular building? And basically he wanted to be very fussy about details, but he never went back to check. He didn't care. So
But Proust was stationary.
Proust was in the bedroom.
Right.
You know, that's where he wrote all his books. He was in the bedroom. He went out at night sometimes.
Did he know he knew no other languages?
Oh, he translated Ruskin into French,
Right.
but he didn't know English.
Not well.
He didn't know English.
Right.
So his mother helped him. His
Yeah.
mommy helped him to write the book. Okay, it's embarrassing. Okay.
Let's go back to, so
Okay, sorry.
1994. No. It's great. There's nothing better than digressions. In
2007.
13 years after your first book, you write a novel,
Right.
and it does very well, critically. I don't know whether you were happy with it or not, but I won't even ask. You don't have to
ask,
answer.
yeah.
And then there comes a series of novels,
Right.
4, 5, White Nights, Enigma,
Harvard Square.
Harvard Square.
Find Me.
Yeah. So, and then you come back to
Right.
essays. Talk about this. What was this sort of gestating through those years when you're writing the novels?
Yes, it was. This book was, I wanted to write it for many years. In fact, the last chapter of my book called Alibis, which came out, I think, in 2012, has the word
Yeah.
Irrealis already. So I was already sort of playing with that idea. The idea that my whole life might have been. I could have been somebody. I could have been somebody else. Had I stayed in Egypt, I would have basically inherited my father's factory. I would have become a businessman. I may never have written a book. Fine, that too, as many critics will say. You shouldn't have written a single one. Anyway, but what I'm trying to say is that I became aware that there was another dimension, and I became aware of it very simply. For those of you who know French, forgive me for a second. The other people, forgive me. The imperfect tense in French has a particular kind of ending, and the conditional mood in French has the same ending, except that there's an R added to the ending. And that's all the difference. So I always knew that the imperfect tense, which is the past tense that never quite stopped, or you never know when it stopped, and the conditional, which is something that should or might still be, and might, I felt that they were both inhabiting me, and I wanted to make sense of that. And I didn't want to write an essay about myself because I had already done that. I wanted to write an essay about Beethoven. I wanted to write an essay about Freud, about Sloane the painter, about a movie director called Eric Romer that I happen to love a lot, and so on. So I imposed on them this irrealis condition, which they were never aware of and might even refute, but I imposed it on them in order to read myself better. And so I used them the way we all do when we read a book and we say, that book spoke to me. Probably never did, but it spoke to you because it said things about yourself that you hadn't quite considered and are happy that somebody else did the talking for you and made you discover things. And that's exactly what I do with, Joyce, Proust, Beethoven, and so on.
In your novels, do you get a sense that, I'm just trying to think them through, but I'm not going to answer the question. You're going to answer the question.
Oh, gee. Okay.
Are any of your characters rooted in a time, in a place, in a present, in a way that you are not or would like to be?
No, I don't think they are.
They're all
Vaguely sort of fuzzy.
they're all floating.
Yeah, one of them doesn't even have a name. In a book that is called Eight White Nights.
Eight White Nights, right.
The narrator, the protagonist of the book does not have a name, or at least you don't know what his name is. You don't know where he lives. You don't know what he does for a living. You know nothing, because I wasn't interested. I was more interested in what goes on in his head.
And in Harvard Square is
Me.
a brilliant, obviously, but it's a brilliant novel of rootlessness.
Yes. And
and the question in Harvard Square and in a bunch of the other novels is whether one can find refuge in rootlessness, or rootlessness is is considered to be a transitory phase that one is hoping to escape.
right, to grow out of.
Yeah.
Yeah. No, rootlessness is there forever. And I tell this to many people that, I am such and such. No, that's just your job. That's your profession. Tell me about yourself. In fact, the question I always like to ask people is, tell me who you are, but don't tell me what religion, what nationality, who your parents were, what you're doing for life, and what school you did. Tell me who you are, in essence. Without these crutches, you have no idea who you are. And suddenly you have to give me an answer. I mean, usually it's after a few drinks. It becomes harder, okay? But in essence, all my characters are unrooted or sort of deracinated. They don't have an identity. And that's why I like Sebald so much, because all his characters are fundamentally free-floating.
But would you say the same of Proust?
I think so,
Yeah,
yes, definitely.
definitely, right.
Yeah.
Did, you don't have to answer this one either. For how long after Call Me By Your Name does Find Me come out? 10 years?
10 years, yeah.
10 years.
Actually, more than 10 years.
Is it? Yeah.
Like almost 13 years.
Okay, the same as from Out of Egypt. Yeah.
Yeah.
Maybe we found something here. Did you want to write? Did you want to resolve the rootlessness of your characters? Did you want to? I mean, it took a while.
I think for Find Me, for those of you who know the book, you don't have to know. The first 3 chapters are really about, they take place in, guess where? New York, Rome, and Paris, 3 cities that I know quite well. Okay, and so the 4th one is a kind of resolution, and it's only about 10 pages long, and it takes place in Alexandria. So I figured I've covered all my bases. I've given these characters the kind of scope they needed, enough already. So I'm moving on to other things.
I thought it was one of the more perversely brilliant or brilliantly perverse sequels that's ever been written, because the 2 main characters who meet, fall in love, separate in the first novel. And I think a lot of the people who picked up Find Me thinking that this is a sequel, and it's going to be about how they find each other again and find happiness or don't find happiness, or they don't appear together until the last 10 pages.
Yes, exactly.
And it is and you don't know at the end what's going to happen to him.
Right. But there's not a third part coming.
Well, they can't be, because you've made it clear that there is no, resolution, that this rootlessness is an ontological state.
Right.
That can't be transcended, that shouldn't be transcended. There is, again, I'm going back to something you said very much earlier about how we want to, or we think we should be living in a here and now. We should seize the moment, seize the day, be in the present. And yet, in Homo Irrealis and in your novels, the present, there is no present. The present is just a brief moment that is a window on a past that was or should have been,
Right.
and an expectation of a future that maybe will be or maybe won't be.
Totally correct. And just to pick up where you left off, there's a scene in Call Me By Your Name which was eliminated entirely from the movie, and I understand why it had to be, because it's just too languorous as a scene. But it's a scene that takes place in Rome. How many of you have seen the film Call Me By Your Name? Okay. It doesn't exist, okay?
We won't ask how many have read the book.
No, I never ask that question. I think I'm stupid. No, but the reason why I mentioned that book is that the chapter in Rome is basically, Elio, the protagonist, is essentially seeing a new life of people in Rome. They're all intellectuals, they're filmmakers, they're composers, writers, and he's among them, and he says, my God, this is a brilliant moment. And I try to sort of excavate that moment and make it, and sort of allow it to radiate into his life. And that's the life he wanted. He's never going to live that life. But it's it's almost a projected life that he's not even aware that he's projecting it, but I think the reader is aware. And that's what I enjoy doing, because I didn't want to root anything. Even their love, it seems that they know their love is going to peter out, if not in their hearts, certainly physically, because they're going to be living in two different countries. And I love that, because it defines me. It is my way of appropriating whatever fiction I invent for people and making it reverberate into my life. And so that's the real answer.
The best way to describe, I think, or for me, the best way to describe the Irrealis moment, or this absence of a present that we all live with, is to look at music. There is no present in a piece of music. It's always moving somewhere. It's always fleeing into a future that is, in a sense, but only in a sense, preordained by the present. And yet, as it flees into the future, right, there are resonances of what has come before. There are themes, there are melodies, there are notes, there are rhythms. But one of the reasons why I think so many of, maybe not so many, how many books, Enigma Variations, how many books have
music?
Or in the title? Just Enigma Variation?
But Find Me is all about music.
Find Me is all about music. Yeah. And all in here, there are a bunch about music. Are you going to write more about Beethoven?
I don't think so.
Are you going to write more about Bach? Bach speaks to you in here.
Bach speaks to me in that case, yes.
You talk.
Yes, we have a conversation. I'm drunk, but it's okay.
Yeah.
How else do you talk to Bach?
Yeah. But there's this wondrous sense in music that we love, certainly in Beethoven and Bach, to use two of the figures you're using here, where I'm just riffing here, so stay with me. In Beethoven's Ninth, or in a Schubert sonata, there's a moment. I'll take one moment, one of my favorite moments in Beethoven's Ninth, where this marching band arrives out of nowhere. If you haven't heard it, go home and listen to it again. In the last movement, the marching band arrives out of nowhere and then disappears, and yet you can't get it out of your mind. In Bach, just keeps moving in the Goldberg Variations.
Oh my God, yes.
It just keeps moving, but there are memories. There are resonances which never fade. And that's part of the Irrealis movement, and that's not a deficit, to go back to this. I mean, it's not a deficit, I'm repeating myself, not to have a fixed identity.
It's not a deficit, but if it is a deficit, it's a deficit that is a plus. Sorry to use that kind of language. In other words, to be aware that you are lacking an identity, in other words, that you have a minus identity, is seemingly a deficit. But in fact, the realization that you don't have an identity, that you don't need one, is itself a plus. So it's as if you had two negatives added to a word.
Do you want a moment before we take questions to rant or rave about identity politics, identity literature?
No, because I do that in my classrooms. Why would I do it here?
Yeah.
No, I don't want to do that. No,
Okay.
Definitely not.
But there is a richness. There is a richness to this lack of identity, this lack of a fixed identity, of a rigid identity.
Can I read something? I know you have questions, if you have questions, but I will read something about the Song of Thanksgiving that Beethoven composed, which I think is my favorite piece by Beethoven, probably in all of classical music. The Song of Thanksgiving is a handful of notes, plus a sustained, overextended hymn in the Lydian mode, which the composer loves and doesn't want to see end, because he likes repeating questions and deferring answers, because all answers are easy, because it's not answers or clarity or even ambiguity that Beethoven is seeking. What he's after is deferral and distended time, a grace period that never expires, and that is all cadence that staves off the scariest chaos awaiting next door called death. Beethoven will keep repeating and extending the process until he's reduced to its barest elements, to one note, two notes, and then no note at all. The fullness of the absence after the final note is the whole point, and he's fearless in making us hear it. And maybe all art strives for just that, life without death. I think that's what art is. It's basically a denial of this horrible, shameful thing called death, our end. Nobody, of course, none of you is going to die. I'm certainly not going to die, okay? Right? Come on, say yes and make me feel good. We pretend we know we will, but we're not going to. Anyway, that's the end of it, so that's my Beethoven moment.
A good point at which to take questions.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. I wanted to ask, Anne Carson has an essay, and she has this wonderful line, and she says, picture this, the fires of Rome are not burning. And she says, you really can't, because you have to insert the fires and then delete them.
Yes.
And she says that language is the only thing that can do that, negate. So I wondered what you think about that. And if you just totally agree, but if not, if you agree, if there's something else besides music too that you feel does that, negates.
I think, I'm sure there must be. I was just thinking of music because music is for me the most, it's a vital aspect of my life. I listen to music. I don't play music, but I know it quite well. I mean, you never get to know it. But I do think that the fire, in order to think of the fire, you have to ignite it. But you cannot ignite it because it's not there and it has disappeared. And just to talk about Rome, you know very well that Freud, when he wrote about Rome, Freud was a great historian, an archaeologist as well. And so when he writes about Rome, he's not only looking at the buried essence of Rome, but he's looking at the buried under the buried ones. And behind that one, there's still another one. And so I love that idea, and I've used it in my books several times, the idea that it is the rebuilt detritus that you're looking for. In other words, there was an attempt to rebuild this wall, and it is now no longer in existence because there was one before it, and that one has disappeared, and the next one has also disappeared. And so you have a history of sort of destruction that leaves no trace. So the fire of Rome can't exist anymore because if you imagine it, you're imagining wrongly. And I'm using this wrong adverb.
Okay. Anyone else have a question? And over here.
Hello, I'm glad you're here. I bought your book. I read it in 1994.
Okay.
And it's hard for me to believe that it's 30 years nearly.
Yes.
Yes. But you don't mention politically what was happening in the world, in that part of the world, that led your family to have its business confiscated and for you to have to flee. And there are young people here who know nothing of that history.
But it's okay, because one of the things I didn't want to do, and that goes back to my distinction between memoir and autobiography, or history for that matter, is that I did not check any history. Whatever history I thought I knew, I put into the book. What I relied on was not going back to archives. It was more or less going back to gossip. The gossip I heard in my family became facts for me to build on. I knew it was ridiculous to do that, but I wanted to capture how does one live with gossip when history basically calls the lie, as it were. But you don't have history yet. History does not exist. And so I didn't want to sort of document what happened to us. I'd much rather have the way it was told and the way it was related to me, the way my father lost his business. I didn't want to explain the whys, the historical whys. I wanted to relay what it felt like to see my father having lost something that he took a whole lifetime to build. And so that's where I went. So yes, no history, no explanation that are historical. Of course, as David has just said, history itself is just an interpretation of facts. I just wanted the gossip, which is it's a form of interpretation many rungs lower.
Yeah, thank you very much. Oh, sure, I'll stand up. So it's been wonderful to listen to both of you in dialogue and getting to know you over the course of this festival a little bit. My question kind of builds on that idea of history and the personal. And I wanted to ask about this concept of the uprooted, because there's a very famous history by Oscar Handlin with that title. I think it was published 50 or 60 years ago. And how much is that concept of the uprooted as a kind of existential condition a result of our present circumstances? And also is looking at that uprooted condition, how does that change our present understanding of crises such as
David, you take this. This
refugees seeking asylum and immigrants, that are oftentimes trying to go from one place to another and leaving something behind, but gaining something new in terms of their own personal narratives.
When Hanlon's book was published, graduate students and historians, cheered, celebrated, also because he was the first Jew at Harvard. And he wrote first about Boston Irish, and then he wrote The Uprooted. Within a decade or a generation, my generation of historians that came after disagreed rather profoundly with the notion of being uprooted as a permanent state. And a man named John Bodner wrote a book called The Transplanted. So what I've been trying to argue with my students, and a little bit with André, is that to be uprooted, to become a refugee, to become displaced, is a transitory state. The uprooted, the refugee, the immigrant, has a resilience and an agency that we too often overlook. We want to treat the uprooted as a victim only, as a deficit. You've lost your home. But if we look very carefully, more broadly, at history, we find that the uprooted are transplanted. Now, that does not diminish the suffering in any way. They were victims, but they refused to remain, most of them, in a state of victimhood. I mean, we look at the refugee camps in Jordan, where Palestinian refugees are now in their second and third generation. They have agency, and they have transplanted themselves. This is the extreme situation. So I think there's a dialectic that has to be maintained between being uprooted and being transplanted. And it's the same dialectic that I see in André's life and work, that being displaced is not a terminal condition. It is part of one's life, but a part. It does not define, and it does not have to define one's life. A long answer to a short question.
Thank you very much. I have really enjoyed this as much as I've been able to sit around. But I wanted to find out if you thought the idea of being unmoored or uprooted, or as you've introduced now, being transplanted, is contributed to by the identity, to use the word loosely, imputed by people looking externally to the person who has experienced the departure, or their own internal expression of it, internal understanding of it?
Well, I can attempt to answer it from my perspective, and then I think David might take this question far better than I can. I do think that what has happened to many uprooted, or whatever you want to call them, transplanted people, is that they are transplanted, they're trying to make a living, they're trying to basically put their lives together again. But they're now, because there's a generous response to them as well, or sometimes not so generous, they are also borrowing the identity that has been imposed on them by the people who are the autochthonous people, the people who live in the ground where they have now become transplanted, and that they are borrowing the identity they think is the one that they are now going to live with, as well as their own identity, as well as the identity they're trying to forge. So that it's sort of a many-tiered composite that I think the worst part is that they're now borrowing an identity that's not theirs, that they never considered theirs, but that they now have to play up to in order to accommodate how they're being looked at. which is not usually the case with many refugees. They come as refugees, they adopt the country they're in, and that's the end of that. Generations later, you forget that. But now I don't know.
I would simply say that the history or the narrative of the displaced, of the refugee, of the immigrant, has to be written by the displaced, the refugees, and the immigrants. Their story, their narrative, their consciousness, their experience of displacement or of uprootedness and transplanted is going to teach us what it means. And to write about it from the outside does not tell the story, tells a partial narrative, which is a false narrative.
Yeah, but what I'm saying is that they are borrowing the way that they are perceived in order to fulfill that perception, which is not really theirs. So they have multiple identities already as it is.
That's all we have time for. So, thank you.
Thank you all. Thank you so
very
much.